The gym smelled of mold and floor polish, like someone had tried to clean the past and only managed to smear it. Half the fluorescent lights were dead, leaving long ribs of shadow between the living bulbs. On the far wall, the faded mascot, a cartoon timber wolf, peeled in curling strips, its painted grin splitting at the jaw. Benches waited along the sidelines like empty pews, and the old scoreboard loomed blank, its digital eyes dark, as if refusing to keep time anymore. Wind threaded through a cracked window high in the rafters, making the torn nets whisper and sigh. It was after hours. It felt after everything. Detective Elias stood at center court, soles of his shoes anchored to the faint circle where generations had leapt for the opening tip. This was where they used to gather on winter nights, the whole town breathing the same damp air, cheeks red from the cold, voices bouncing off the rafters. Now dust floated in the stale light, a slow, weightless snowfall. He lifted his eyes to the bleachers, to the third row up, left-hand side. A small square of wood had been replaced there, the color just slightly wrong, too new, too clean. That was where she used to sit. That was where they'd first noticed she wasn't there. Maris Cline, 17. Freckles that never quite faded, no matter how long summer ended. Played piano for the choir because her hands shook too much to shoot free throws. Said the ball felt like a heart she was afraid of dropping. Daughter of the man who fixed everyone's cars and never raised his voice. She'd worn her hair in a single dark braid down her back, a habit from childhood that made her easy to pick out in any crowd, until she was gone and crowds became a kind of violence. Elias could still see that night if he let his mind tilt just so. The buzzer, the roar, the crush of bodies spilling out through the doors into the cold Oregon dark. Someone said, "Where's Maris?" Someone else laughed it off. Parents calling, "Hey, you coming?" The slow realization that no one had seen her since halftime. The way silence spread through the parking lot like spilled oil. He'd been 16 then, not detective, just Eli, the kid who'd promised he'd walk her home after the game. He closed his eyes, and the gym emptied out around him, collapsing into soundless memory. For a moment he felt the exact weight of his younger self's jacket on his shoulders, the raw sting of cold air in his lungs as he jogged toward the back exit to look for her. He could hear the high ring of panic begin in his ears, the thin keening that had never really stopped. His phone buzzed in his pocket, dragging him back to the present. The sound felt wrong here, sharp and modern, slicing through the decades. He didn't answer. Instead, he turned in a slow circle, surveying the shadows. The banners above him, green and gold, drooped like exhausted lungs. The polished wood reflected him in broken fragments. Oregon, 1978, might as well have been on another planet. But the town hadn't changed as much as it pretended. Same low clouds pressing down. Same damp. Same people walking the same streets, glancing sidelong at the same memories they refused to name. Cold case, the file had said. Then, solved, scrawled in a later hand, a different pen. The ink darker, more recent. A single word that should have meant relief. It didn't. He felt it like a hand on the back of his neck. Solved. As if anything about Maris had ever been simple enough for a word like that. The echo of his footsteps followed him as he walked toward the bleachers. Each hollow thud settled somewhere behind his ribs. He wasn't just here for evidence. He wasn't even sure he was here for justice. He was here because this gym had become a shape inside him, a dark room he carried from city to city, case to case. No matter how many bodies he'd zipped into bags, no matter how many families he'd given his gentle practice condolences, everything came back to this. A girl who never walked out of a game, and the boy who never walked her home. He rested his hand on the railing, feeling the chill of the metal. The whole building seemed to be listening. "Maris," he murmured, the name barely audible, more breath than sound. It vanished instantly, swallowed by the gym's huge, indifferent lungs. Outside, the town's single main road hummed softly under. But in here, time stayed stalled between buzzer and silence, between promise and absence. Elias stood in that pause, letting it close around his throat. The past, he'd learned, wasn't a series of events. It was a room like this. It was something you could never quite leave. The call had come 3 weeks earlier, just after dawn, when the sky over Portland was a thin scrap of gray light. Elias had been sitting at his kitchen table, counting the cracks in the ceramic mug he never replaced, when the phone vibrated against the wood like a small, anxious animal. A pause, then Chief's voice softened by distance and an old, careful guilt. "Eli, it's Birchwood." The name slid under his skin. Birchwood, the town he'd left, the town that never left him. Hills cut out of wet black fur, a river that moved slow and cold, streets that curved back on themselves in loops like thoughts you couldn't shake. "I'm listening," Elias said. "They're tearing down the old Cline place." The chief swallowed. Elias could hear it. Demolition crew found something in the crawl space. Thought it might be, human remains. It's not. But they everything sent the photos over. I took one look and well, it's from the old case, Eli, has to be. He felt his chest tighten. "Maris." "Yeah." A scrape of paper on the other end of the line. "They found a shoe, one of hers, we think, and something else. A little trinket, you should see it with your own eyes." A trinket had called it, because men like him didn't have another word for objects that lived halfway between evidence and prayer. Now, in the quiet of the old gym, Elias reached into his coat and drew out a small, clear evidence bag. It clicked faintly when his fingers brushed it, like teeth tapping together. Inside sat the object that had pulled him back to Birchwood after all these years, a silver charm in the shape of a small, imperfectly cut piano key. The edges were worn soft, the metal dulled by time and touch. A faint scratch ran diagonally across it, a thin scar catching the light. He knew it instantly. Everyone who'd known Maris would have. She'd worn it on a chain, the little key resting just below the notch of her throat, a gift from her mother after her first recital. The story was town legend, repeated at bake sales and church potlucks until it became part of her. The shy girl with the shaking hands who'd sat at the school's upright piano and played while the entire gym held its breath. She'd touched it before every performance, that key, as if turning something inside herself. They'd never found it in 78. Not in the search of the woods, not in the sweep of the river, not in the reluctant open trunks of cars in the parking lot. Her disappearance had left a shape, and the missing charm had been part of that shape, a small, glittering absence at the center of a larger one. Yet the demolition workers had found it under the Cline house, in the low slit of space between earth and joists, pressed into the damp soil like a seed. The report said it must have fallen through a gap in the floorboards, misplaced, accident, not necessarily meaningful. But Elias didn't believe in that kind of accident, not anymore. He turned the bag slowly in his fingers, watching the light shiver along the scratched metal. In the reflection, his face warped, sliced by the plastic into strips. They'd also found the shoe, a scuffed white canvas sneaker, laces stiff and browned, a faint grass stain blooming along the sole. Different bag, different shelf in his motel room. He hadn't brought it with him today. The shoe felt too close to bone. The charm, though. The charm was a voice. He heard her father's protests in the back of his mind, remembered from the week before. "We had nothing to do with it. Nothing. Maris wouldn't, she was. Why would her things be under our house?" Words trailed off, frayed by years of unslept nights. They searched back then, your people. They didn't find anything. Your people. As if Elias hadn't been the kid standing in the yard, watching the troopers pry up boards, smelling the cold earth and fear. He stood there, fists jammed into his pockets, feeling every thud and crowbar creak as if they were landing in his own chest. Mari's mother had been on the porch, clutching the railing so tightly the paint had peeled under her fingers. Now, decades later, the ground had given something back. Not a body, not an answer. A symbol small enough to be overlooked, potent enough to call the past out of hiding. You should see it with your own eyes, had said. But it wasn't the charm the chief wanted him to look at. It was what it did to him. Because as soon as Elias had seen the attached crime scene photo, the key half buried in damp soil, a soft halo of dirt around it, a thought had risen in him, silent and undeniable. I should have found it. Back then, when the house creaked with strangers and radios crackled in the yard, he'd been the one kid allowed to move through the rooms. People trusted him. The boy, good kid, quiet, helpful. He'd carried coffee, blankets, flashlights. He'd heard the troopers mutter doubts. Runaway, boyfriend, teenagers, you know. He could have slipped away, lifted a loose board, followed a hunch, listened to the tremor in his own chest. But he hadn't. Now the charm sat in his hand, touching him through the thin membrane of plastic, reminding him of that failure with every slow breath. Elias slid the bag carefully back into his pocket. His fingers lingered there, as if to keep it from falling away again. When the case file had been updated, cold case, SOLVID, the official story had come with it, an arrest, a narrative that made sense to the town even if it strained against the grain of his memory. DNA, they said, new techniques, old evidence re-examined. But the charm had not been logged in those old lists, which meant the story had a hole in it, a dark crawl space of its own. From the bleachers, the gym's silence pressed down, heavy as earth. Elias felt the old night open beneath his feet, as if one wrong step would send him sliding back into 1978, into the version of himself who'd stood shivering in this same building, telling the officers, "I was supposed to walk her home." Supposed to. Words that sounded like an alibi, but felt like an accusation. The rediscovery of that tiny piano key did more than reopen a file. It up a board in his mind, letting in the smell of damp soil and unfinished questions. The town could call it closure. The headlines could say solved. For Elias, it was something else. It was an invitation to descend. The drive back into Birchwood had felt like slipping into a shirt he'd, seams pulling at the shoulders, collar tight against his throat. Trees crowded the highway, the firs and hemlocks leaning in close, their dark green the same as in every memory he tried to outpace. Fog stitched the hills together. The sign announcing the town's name was new, the paint not yet peeled, but the letters still carried the old weight. He should have felt like an outsider, returning as a detective from the city case folder under his arm. Instead, the town recognized him in ways that had nothing to do with his badge. At the diner, the waitress slid coffee in front of him without asking. "Good to see you, Eli," she'd said, then caught herself. "Detective, I mean, heard you're here about the old you-know thing." Her voice fell away, swallowed by the clink of plates and the low murmur of other conversations abruptly steering elsewhere. He'd nodded, not trusting his own voice. The badge in his pocket felt like a prop. The real reason he was here wasn't written on any warrant or requisition form. It lived in the hollow under his sternum, where the image of her empty seat in homeroom had camped out for 47 years. Officially, he'd argued for his involvement by citing continuity, familiarity with the town, a unique perspective on the original investigation. The chief in Portland had hesitated, then looked at him with a gaze that lingered a second too long, as if seeing the boy under the gray at his temples. "You sure this is about the case?" she asked. He'd held her stare, feeling something tighten in his jaw. "It's about doing the job right. Half-truth, quarter maybe." The rest was something he didn't name, because once some things had names, they were harder to dismiss as coincidence, harder to walk away from. Now in the gym, he lowered himself cautiously onto the third-row bleacher, the one they'd replaced. The wood creaked under his weight, a small complaint. His knees ached more than he remembered. Time had stolen cartilage but left guilt perfectly intact. He pictured Maris sitting where he was now, knees pressed together, fingers twisted in the hem of her skirt as he'd stumbled over some joke beside her. He couldn't remember the joke anymore, just the way her smile had arrived a fraction late, as if traveling from far away. "You always sound like you're apologizing," she once told him, eyes on the court, "even when you're not saying sorry." "Sorry," he'd said automatically, and she'd laughed, a small, astonished sound like a breath catching on an unexpected note. The memory made his chest tighten. He wasn't supposed to let himself sink this far into it. Training cautioned against over-identification. You are not the victim. You are not the witness. You are not the perpetrator. You are the lens. But he had never been only the lens in this case. He was part of the image. He took the file from his coat and opened it on his knees. Photos, typed pages, a map of the town with black marking last known. The new pages, the ones that had come with the word SOLVID, sat on top, edges sharp, smell of printer toner still faintly clinging. He flipped past them to the older reports, his thumbs finding them the way fingers find rosary beads. There, buried in the narrative, was his own name on a yellowed page. Statement of Elijah, age 16. He'd read it so many times the words had lost their meaning, but now he forced himself to see them again, as if they were someone else. "I told her I'd walk her home. We got separated in the crowd at halftime. I thought she went to the bathroom. I waited by the west doors. I figured she'd catch up. I figured, as if his assumptions formed a kind of innocent whether no one could be blamed for. He felt heat creep up his neck, despite the chill in the gym. The arrest, decades later, was supposed to have shifted the spotlight away from that moment, supposed to have reframed everything. Joseph Harrow, the man they'd finally charged, fit the role cleanly. Drifter who'd worked at the mill one summer, prior assault charge in another state, DNA recovered from a scrap of fabric preserved in the evidence box by some clerk's unconscious mercy. Harrow had confessed, sort of, enough to satisfy most people. But when Elias had read the transcript, something in him recoiled. "I don't remember her face," Harrow had said, "just the shape. It was cold, dark. They were all the same then." The town had gasped in outrage at the callousness of it. Monster, they murmured. Evil. They built a cage of those words around him, relieved to have somewhere to put their fear. Elias had heard something else. The emptiness of a man telling a story he'd rehearsed but never felt. Maybe Harrow had done it. Maybe monsters didn't have to feel anything. But the more Elias revisited the pages, the more the confession sounded not like an opening of truth, but like a door slamming shut. And then there was the charm, turning up under the Cline house after the arrest warrant was signed. He traced a finger over his younger self statement, over the gaps between what he'd said and what he'd felt back then. There were things he'd left out, small things, stupid he'd thought at the time, embarrassing maybe, not important. The way Maris had been quieter than usual that week. The way she'd looked past him when he joked about getting out of Birchwood, her gaze snagging on something miles away. The argument he'd overheard in the Cline kitchen 2 nights before the game. Her father's voice low and rough, her mother's like paper tearing, Maris a thin thread woven between them. Words he couldn't quite make out, only the rhythm of them, the jagged edges. And that last conversation in the hallway before the game when she'd said, "If I don't show up, don't wait, okay?" And he'd thought she was teasing, some private joke he wasn't in on. He'd laughed, "What, you planning to disappear?" The look she'd given him, brief, startled, almost tender, had been lost in the chaos of the band tuning up and the squeak of sneakers on tile. He hadn't told the detectives any of that. Back then, he hadn't known how to frame it, how to say I think she was pulling away from something or toward something, and I was too afraid to ask what. Now, every omitted detail felt like a crime of its own. This was where duty blurred into obsession, the line between what he owed the dead girl in the file and what he owed the boy in his memory. Maybe that was why the charm had surfaced now, because he couldn't let it stay buried, not when its absence was tangled with his own. The more he read the case file, the more it felt less like a record of an investigation and more like a mirror maze. Every route he took brought him back to himself, to the places he'd flinched away from looking. He closed the folder gently. The gym felt smaller now, closing in around him, the air dense with the ghost of winter breath and crowd noise. The official channels would have him focus on the new evidence, on corroborating Harrow's confession, on building a case the DA could parade in front of the cameras with phrases like long-awaited justice and community healed. But Elias' steps were already drifting elsewhere. Not toward the man in the cell. Toward the girl in the gaps. His phone buzzed again. He checked the screen. A text from DA wants an update, press sniffing around, remember the narrative. He stared at the words, thumb hovering. Remember the narrative. Out in the parking lot, a crow cawed once, harsh and solitary. The sound slipped in through the cracked window, sharp as a reprimand. Elias typed back slowly, working the angles, "We'll call later." He hit send, then powered the phone off. The sudden absence of its small glow made the gym feel even dimmer, the shadows thicker, more honest. He slid the device into his pocket, next to the cold, hard shape of the charm. Duty said he was here to confirm what the town had already decided to believe. Obsession whispered that he was here to find the thing that narrative was hiding, even if that thing lived inside him. He sat in silence, listening to the old building breathe, feeling the past align itself around him like a noose he'd tied with his own hands. The motel sat on the edge of Birchwood like something the town had shrugged off decades ago and forgotten to reclaim. Its sign flickered between vac NCY and vacancy, the missing letter pulsing like a skipped heartbeat. Elias stood outside room 7, coat pulled tight against the cold, watching the parking lot lamps cast faint amber halos on the asphalt. Every light buzzed faintly, the sound too brittle to ignore. Inside, the air smelled of old carpet and the faint ghost of pine disinfectant. He set the case file on the lone wooden desk and rubbed the bridge of his nose. The charm in his pocket felt heavier than metal should allow, as if absorbing everything he didn't say out loud. A knock came softly, 2 taps hesitant. He opened the door to find Cline standing there, hair unbrushed, coat unzipped, the cold reddening her cheeks. She was older now, lines etched around her eyes, but the bone structure was unmistakable. Same narrow jaw as her sister, same steadiness in the gaze. "You're going to keep the door open," she said, not a question. He stepped aside. When she sat on the motel chair, it wobbled under her, legs uneven. She placed her hands on her knees, fingers twisted in each other. "I heard you're looking into this again." Elias nodded. "The object they found." "I know what they found." A tremor cut across her voice, not weakness but restraint stretched thin. "Dad's not doing well, you know. This is tearing him open again." Elias sank onto the edge of the bed. "I'm not here to hurt your family." "Then why are you here?" Her gaze sharpened. "They arrested a man. They closed the case. You think you know something the rest of us do." He didn't answer at first. His eyes drifted to the motel desk, to the case file spread open like a wound. "Your sister, she wasn't herself that week, was she?" His breath caught. "You remember that?" "Some." "The rest?" She leaned forward. "What else do you remember, Eli?" The room tightened around them. Shadows shrank and sharpened. "I remember her asking me not to wait for her that night." His voice felt scraped raw. "I didn't understand why." Looked down at her hands, her voice dropped to a whisper. "She asked me something too. The night before she vanished, she asked if I'd come with her." Elias felt the words strike deeper than any revelation so far. "She wanted to leave?" he asked. "Maybe," exhaled slowly. "Or maybe she just wanted out of whatever she felt trapped inside." She lifted her eyes and Elias saw fear, regret, exhaustion, but no surprise. She'd lived inside this grief her whole life. And now they're saying that man Harrow took her, but the truth isn't that tidy. It never was. He waited. Silence wasn't empty, it was a reservoir. Finally she said, "You're not the only one who carries guilt, you know." The motel heater clicked loudly, then fell silent again. Elias forced himself to ask, "Did she seem afraid of someone?" A long pause. "Yes," said quietly, "but not who everyone assumes." Before he could ask more, another knock sounded, this one louder, abrupt. Elias opened the door to find Chief, her expression grim, posture stiff. "We need to talk," she said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. Her gaze landed on, "I didn't realize you two were." "We're not," said sharply, rising from the chair. Folded her arms. "Miss Cline, it's best you don't interfere." "Interfere?" Let out a weak, bitter laugh. "It's my sister." But had already turned toward Elias, lowering her voice. "The DA wants you off this. They don't want complications right now. The community finally has closure." Elias stiffened. "Closure doesn't override truth." Sighed, "What you're digging at, it won't end the way you want." He felt eyes on him, a silent plea mixed with resignation. "You can either follow orders," said, "or you can keep going down a path that leads nowhere good." Her hand hovered near the doorknob. The message was clear, the door was closing. Stepped closer to Elias, voice low. "She trusted you, Eli. If you turn away now, she'll disappear for a second time." His jaw tightened. "This isn't personal." But it was, for all three of them. Left first, brushing past the chief with a brittle nod. Followed her to the door, then paused, eyes returning to Elias. "Think about what you're doing," she said. When she left, Elias was alone with the case file, the charm, and the long, trembling line between duty and something far more dangerous. The next morning, fog clung to Birchwood like a second skin. Elias returned to the evidence room, a converted basement beneath the town hall. The walls smelled of damp and old paper. A single flickering fluorescent flicked overhead. He set the thin folder of Maris' recovered belongings on the table. The shoe, the charm, a folded program from the school concert, a diary, weathered, edges curled, faint water damage along the spine. The diary had never been logged in